She shouted, "I'm a doctor," and saved a stranger's life on the street. She never imagined that man would be a billionaire CEO who'd change everything. The city was alive with noise, lights, and motion. Cars rushed past in organized chaos. Pedestrians bustled along the sidewalks with coffee in hand and headphones in their ears, all swallowed by the rhythm of a late Friday afternoon in Manhattan. But amidst the movement, a small figure stood out. Sophie Brooks, 6 years old, blonde hair tucked under a knit hat with two tiny ears on top, and a coat that looked a little too big for her tiny frame. She clutched a small plush bunny with one arm, the other wrapped tightly around her mother's hand, until that hand let go, just for a moment. Allison Brooks, 30 years old, calm and focused even after a 10-hour hospital shift, bent down to Sophie's eye level outside the corner pharmacy. "I just need to grab your vitamins really quick, okay? Stay right here. Don't talk to strangers and don't move from this spot. I'll be right back." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Okay, Mama." Allison kissed the top of her daughter's head and disappeared into the shop. Sophie watched her go, her bunny swinging slightly as she hummed to herself and looked up at the snowflakes starting to fall. People brushed past her without looking down. She was used to it. New York didn't have time for tiny girls with big eyes. Then something strange happened. Across the sidewalk, maybe 20 steps away, a man in a dark blue coat staggered. He was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe in his 40s. His face was pale. He leaned hard against a lamppost, his hand pressing to his chest as if trying to stop something from breaking inside. Nobody noticed. Everyone kept moving, except Sophie. She froze for a second, unsure, but then her feet started moving. "Sir?" she said, her voice too soft to carry. "Mister?" The man looked at her. His eyes, brown, glassy, filled with pain, met hers for a single heartbeat. He tried to say something, but no words came. He collapsed onto the bench behind him, his breathing shallow, his body stiffening. Sophie's eyes widened. Her mommy had told her what to do if someone fell down. It was simple. Get help. Fast. She turned to the nearest woman in a business suit walking past. "Please, my mommy's a doctor. He's sick." The woman looked confused, then glanced toward the bench. Her eyes widened and she ran toward the man. Another passerby followed. Sophie darted toward the pharmacy. "Mama! Mama!" Inside, Allison was paying at the register when she heard her daughter's voice, urgent and rising with fear. She dropped the bag and sprinted out the door, following Sophie's pointing finger. When Allison saw the man on the bench, her instincts kicked in like a switch. "Someone call 911!" she shouted as she dropped beside him. She checked his pulse. Rapid, weak. His skin was cold and damp. His eyes were fluttering. "It's a cardiac episode," she muttered, rolling him gently onto his back. "Sir, can you hear me? You're going to be okay. I'm right here." Sophie stood frozen nearby, gripping her bunny with white knuckles. Within minutes, sirens wailed and an ambulance pulled to the curb. Allison stayed with the man as EMTs arrived, briefing them with sharp, precise information. "He needs immediate evaluation. Possible myocardial infarction. He lost consciousness for 20 seconds. I stabilized his position, but he's going to need EKG and oxygen support now." The paramedics worked quickly. As they lifted him into the ambulance, the man opened his eyes for a moment and looked at Sophie again. "You, the little girl," he whispered hoarsely. Sophie gave a tiny nod, eyes wide. "I got my mommy." A tear slipped down the side of his face before his eyes closed again. Later, as the crowd thinned and the snow began to coat the streets more heavily, Allison knelt beside Sophie and pulled her into a tight hug. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice shaky with adrenaline. "You did exactly the right thing. I'm so proud of you." Sophie's voice was small. "Is he gonna die?" "No," Allison said softly. "Because of you, he's going to live." Neither of them knew in that moment that the man they had saved wasn't just anyone. His name was Grayson Miles, and he was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. But none of that mattered today. Today, he was just a man whose life had been saved by a 6-year-old girl with courage, and a mother who knew how to heal. And something quietly had begun. The hospital room was quiet, sterile, filled with the low hum of machines and the occasional distant beep from monitors in the hallway. Outside the window, the first snowfall of the season had blanketed the city in white, softening its edges. Inside, Grayson Miles slowly opened his eyes. It took a moment for the world to come into focus. The ceiling was unfamiliar. The air smelled like antiseptic and linens. There was a tightness in his chest, not pain, but the lingering echo of it, a reminder that something had gone wrong. He blinked a few times, adjusting to the light, and then turned his head slowly to the side. A nurse noticed the movement and approached with a warm smile. "Mr. Miles, good to see you awake. You gave everyone quite the scare." Grayson tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse. "What happened?" "You had a mild heart attack. You collapsed on a bench near Fifth Avenue. You were lucky. Someone got help right away. You were treated on the scene and brought here for monitoring." Grayson closed his eyes again briefly. Flashes returned. Cold air, dizziness, a small figure with a bunny, and those eyes. Big, concerned, and much too young. "The little girl," he rasped. "Was she real?" The nurse chuckled gently. "Yes, a 6-year-old, apparently. Her name's Sophie, and her mother's a doctor. She stabilized you until EMS arrived. She may have saved your life." Grayson stared at the ceiling, stunned by the absurdity of it. A child, a complete stranger. He had spent years surrounded by lawyers, assistants, and executives. Yet it was a little girl and her mother who had stood between him and death. "Where are they now?" he asked quietly. "I'm afraid I can't disclose patient or civilian information, but they didn't stick around long. The mother, Dr. Brooks, I believe, left once the paramedics took over. I don't think she wanted recognition." Grayson's brow furrowed. That made sense. The girl had been brave, and the woman had worked like a professional. Fast, precise, controlled. He remembered how calm she looked as she knelt beside him. Not frightened, focused. Later that day, once his vitals were stable and the cardiologist cleared him for overnight observation, Grayson requested his laptop and had his assistant deliver it without delay. He couldn't rest, not until he knew who she was. He started by calling the head of his private security team. "I need a name," he said. "Sir?" "The woman who helped me, the doctor. She was there when I collapsed." "Is this personal?" the man asked, which was code for, "Should we dig deep or back off?" "Yes," Grayson said without hesitation. "It's personal." By the next morning, he had a name. Dr. Allison Brooks, age 30, ER physician at Midtown General. Mother to a 6-year-old named Sophie. Widowed, living in a modest apartment in Queens. No legal issues, no media footprint, no hint of seeking publicity. Grayson read over the report in silence, then scrolled back up to the photo they'd attached. A candid shot of her leaving the hospital, hair pulled back, coat too thin for the weather, child in one hand, coffee in the other. Her face wasn't smiling in the photo. It was tired, focused, like someone with too much responsibility and too little time. But to Grayson, it was the most captivating face he'd seen in years. He didn't understand why he felt this way. He wasn't the man who made personal visits. He wasn't the man who got involved. He donated to foundations, funded hospitals anonymously, and never let emotions steer his judgment. But today, something was different. Maybe it was because he had been on the brink of death, and this woman, along with her brave daughter, had pulled him back. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in as long as he could remember, someone had looked at him not with expectation, not with calculation, but with genuine concern. He couldn't explain it yet, but he knew one thing. He had to see her again. And this time, it wouldn't be because he needed saving. The apartment was small, worn around the edges, but filled with warmth. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting soft gold lines across the hardwood floor. Toys were scattered in the living room, a half-colored page left on the table, and in the air the faint smell of chamomile tea and laundry detergent. This was where life happened, real life, chaotic and honest and unfiltered. Allison Brooks stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a pot of soup. She was still in her scrubs, hair tied into a messy bun, exhaustion evident in the slope of her shoulders. Her mind, however, was far from the pot. The image of Grayson Miles, pale and breathless on that bench, replayed over and over in her head, like a film reel she couldn't stop. She hadn't recognized him in the moment. Not as the CEO of a global investment firm, not as one of the wealthiest and most guarded men in New York. He had simply been a human being in distress, and she'd done what any doctor would, acted on instinct, blocked out emotion, and worked. But now that she knew, now that the news was quietly spreading online and his face was being circulated on morning TV, she felt something else. Fear. She hadn't wanted attention. She hadn't stayed to give a statement. She hadn't even left her full name at the scene. Yet somehow she knew it was only a matter of time before he came looking. Men like him didn't let unanswered questions linger. "Mama," came a small voice behind her. Allison turned to see Sophie, clutching her stuffed bunny, pajamas wrinkled, and curls slightly wild from her nap. "Yes, honey? Is the man okay? The one on the bench?" Allison paused. How did she explain something so big to someone so small? "He's going to be just fine," she said gently, walking over and brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. "You helped him, remember? You were so brave." Sophie's lips curved into a shy smile. "He looked scared." "He was. But he saw you and you helped him feel safe. You called for help, just like I taught you." Sophie beamed with pride, and Allison felt her throat tighten. Her daughter had a way of sensing emotions before they were fully spoken. "Will we see him again?" Sophie asked suddenly. Allison blinked. "What makes you ask that?" Sophie shrugged. "He looked at me funny, like he was sad but also happy, and he said thank you. People don't say it like that unless they mean it really big." Allison knelt beside her, pulling her close. "I don't know, baby. People like him live very different lives from ours. I don't think he'll come back." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed and the apartment had grown still, Allison sat on the worn sofa with her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed in his name. Grayson Miles. The search results exploded with articles, interviews, stock photos, magazine covers. Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, Fortune. Every headline painted him as untouchable, brilliant, enigmatic. He was the kind of man who built empires with quiet ruthlessness and had the world eating from the palm of his hand. Allison let out a breath and closed the screen. What was she even doing? She didn't belong in that world. She wasn't someone a man like him would remember. Except he had looked at Sophie like she was the only thing in the universe. And that look had stayed with her all day. Across town, in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home, Grayson sat alone in his private office. His suit jacket was tossed over a chair, his tie loosened. A glass of untouched whiskey sat on the desk beside an open file. In it, a printed photo of Allison and Sophie walking out of the hospital. He traced a finger across Sophie's image, remembering how she had stood there with her little bunny, eyes filled with concern. He wasn't used to being vulnerable. His life had been built on strength, control, and distance. But in that moment on the bench, when the world had begun to blur and pain had clouded every thought, he'd seen her. Not an angel, not a doctor, a child. One who saw a stranger and ran toward him, not away. And Grayson knew, with the strange, certain instinct that sometimes strikes the heart before the mind can explain it, this little girl, and the woman who raised her, had just changed everything. And he wasn't about to let that go. The automatic doors of Midtown General opened with a hiss, letting in a rush of winter air and one man who stood out among the crowd like a sculpture among shadows. Grayson Miles, dressed not in his usual tailored three-piece suit, but in a simple dark wool coat and scarf, stepped into the lobby with a presence that made heads turn. His eyes scanned the room, efficient, sharp, until they landed on the front desk. He approached calmly, but his heart beat faster than it had in days. "I'm looking for Dr. Allison Brooks," he said to the receptionist, who blinked in surprise at both his presence and the polished certainty in his tone. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No," he replied, voice low but firm. "But I believe she'll want to see me." The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone. Grayson waited, hands clasped behind his back, exuding control. But inside he was far from calm. He had rehearsed this moment too many times in his mind. What would he say? Would she even want to see him? On the second floor, Allison had just ended a grueling consultation with a trauma patient when her name was called over the intercom. She frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she stepped into the hallway and saw him standing there, impossibly composed, the man she'd saved, the man who haunted her thoughts, she stopped mid-step. Her eyes narrowed with hesitation, not recognition, caution. "Mr. Miles," she said carefully, her tone neutral. He gave her a soft smile. "Dr. Brooks, I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," she replied, not harshly but firmly. "This is a hospital, not a reunion venue." "I understand. I just..." I wanted to thank you, in person, properly, she sighed. You already did. I'm glad you're all right, but I don't need recognition. I was just doing my job. He nodded but didn't move. And your daughter? Sophie? The mention of her child made Allison's spine straighten defensively. She's fine. I haven't stopped thinking about her. Or you. What you both did for me. Most people walk by, but she didn't. Because I've taught her to act, not freeze, Allison replied. I'm raising a girl who doesn't ignore suffering. That's not extraordinary. It's parenting. He smiled gently. It's rare, especially in this city. Allison studied him closely. He looked tired, not physically, but in that deep, soul-weary way of a man who had gone too long without real connection. She recognized it because she carried the same weight. Still, she couldn't let herself be drawn in, not by a man like him. Mr. Miles, she said, voice cooling, I appreciate the visit, but I'm not interested in turning a moment of emergency into whatever this is. His jaw tightened slightly. I'm not here to offer charity if that's what you think. I'm here because something shifted for me that day. And I believe, no, I know, you felt it too. Allison's eyes softened for a brief moment before she turned away. You were vulnerable. You saw kindness, and it felt new. But that's not love, Mr. Miles. That's gratitude mixed with fear. Grayson stepped closer, but not too close. Maybe, or maybe for the first time in years, I felt something real, something I didn't know I was missing. Allison's breath caught just for a second. She hated how sincere he sounded. She hated even more that part of her believed him. But life had taught her not to trust fairy tales, especially ones that arrived in Armani coats. I have to get back to work, she said simply. He nodded, then pulled something from his coat pocket. It was a small envelope. For your daughter. I didn't know what to get a 6-year-old, so I made a donation. In her name. To a children's health initiative. I hope you'll let her know it's because of her. Allison took the envelope hesitantly. You didn't have to do that. I know. That's why I did. Their eyes locked for a beat, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Then he turned and walked away. Allison stood there long after he disappeared through the hospital doors. When she opened the envelope later in her office, her hands trembled. Inside was a certificate of donation and a handwritten note. For Sophie, who reminded me what courage looks like. Grayson Miles. She didn't know what this was turning into, but it was no longer something she could ignore. The sky had turned a soft silver gray by the time Allison and Sophie reached the park. Winter hadn't fully set in, but there was a bite in the air that hinted at the cold days ahead. The trees were mostly bare now, their skeletal limbs brushing the wind. The ground was littered with brittle brown leaves, and a few distant children's voices echoed from the other side of the playground. Sophie clutched her mother's hand tightly, her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm as always. They came here most evenings when Allison's shift allowed it, just the two of them, surrounded by the quiet that didn't exist anywhere else in their world. Sophie would run and play while Allison sat on the bench, sipping lukewarm tea from a thermos and letting herself breathe. Today, however, was different. As they rounded the path near the bench they always chose, Allison stopped in her tracks. Grayson Miles was already sitting there. He wore a thick charcoal coat, his hands gloved, his hair slightly tousled from the wind. His gaze was downcast, but he looked up the moment he sensed them. There was something about him, his presence maybe, that made Allison tense for half a second before she forced herself to exhale. Sophie, however, had no hesitation. That's him, she whispered, eyes lighting up with immediate recognition. Mama, the man we helped. Before Allison could respond, Sophie broke free and ran straight toward him. Grayson stood as she approached, kneeling down so he was at her height. Hello again, he said softly. Sophie smiled, her cheeks pink from the cold. You look better now. I feel a lot better thanks to you. She grinned and reached into her coat pocket. I made you something. From the folds of her jacket, she pulled out a folded piece of construction paper. Crayons had been used to draw 3 stick figures. One tall man in a blue coat, one woman in a long white coat with blonde hair, and one small girl holding a bunny. Above them was a red heart floating in the sky. Grayson took the picture with both hands as if it were made of glass. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he swallowed and said, This is the best thing I've received in years. Sophie beamed, then turned and skipped off toward the swing set. Allison finally caught up. stopping a few feet from the bench. She was out of breath, not from the walk, but from the emotional tug she wasn't prepared for. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, crossing her arms. "I wasn't sure you would come," Grayson replied, "but I hoped." There was a pause. "Did you follow me?" He shook his head. "Number. But I remembered what you said about walking in the park after work. I took a chance. Sat here for 20 minutes, thinking maybe, just maybe, you'd show up." "That's a very dramatic gesture," she said, trying to keep her tone even. "I don't do well with drama." "I didn't come for drama," he said quietly. "I came because what happened, hasn't left me. You haven't, and she certainly hasn't." Allison looked away towards Sophie, who was now kicking her legs in the swing, her laughter ringing through the air. "I'm not interested in being someone's fleeting moment of self-discovery," she said finally. Grayson looked at her then, really looked, with a vulnerability that seemed completely at odds with his reputation. "Neither am I. You think I don't know how this sounds? Billionaire survives a heart attack, goes looking for the doctor and her daughter who saved him? It sounds ridiculous, but I'm not here to fix something in myself by borrowing your life. I'm here because when I was on that bench fading, the last thing I saw was your daughter's face, and somehow that mattered more than anything I've built in 40 years. Allison's breath caught. "I've built companies," he continued. "I've changed markets. I've led rooms of people who are twice your age and terrified of failing me. But I've never been more afraid of losing something than I was when I saw her turn away to get help. She didn't freeze. She ran. And she trusted that someone would come. She trusted me," Allison said quietly. "And that's what you gave her," he said. "That's what I haven't had in years." Silence stretched between them, and yet it wasn't empty. It was full of unsaid things, of shared understanding, of weight neither of them had prepared for. "Do you want to sit down?" she asked finally, nodding toward the bench. He smiled faintly and sat. She joined him, slowly. For a while they said nothing. They just watched Sophie swing higher and higher until the sunset turned the sky a shade of peach that neither of them noticed, because both were staring at something else entirely. The possibility of something beginning. Something neither of them had planned. But maybe, just maybe, something worth staying for. The following weeks unfolded slowly, like the first pages of a new book neither of them had expected to write. What had started as a chance encounter became a string of small, meaningful moments that neither Allison nor Grayson could quite explain, but couldn't walk away from either. They began meeting casually. If anything between a world-famous CEO and a single working mother could be called casual. At first it was simple. Coffee outside the hospital on her break, short walks in the park when their schedules aligned, and an unspoken understanding that neither was rushing anything. It wasn't a romance. Not yet. But it was something tender, honest, and cautious. Grayson had never slowed down for anyone before. His entire adult life had been a race. Faster, higher, more. He made his first million before age 25 and hadn't stopped building empires since. His phone had always been an extension of his hand, his schedule booked down to the minute. But when he was with Allison, none of that seemed to matter. She grounded him in a way that no one else ever had. She didn't care who he was in the boardroom. She didn't care about his wealth or reputation. In fact, she often rolled her eyes at his excesses, especially when he tried to send a driver or have gourmet lunches delivered to her shift. He once brought her coffee in a cup made of recycled gold leaf, and she handed it back with a smirk, saying, "You do know they sell perfectly good coffee downstairs, right?" But it wasn't just her sarcasm he was drawn to. It was the way she listened, the way she looked at him like he was a man, not a machine, not a brand. And Sophie saw him like no one else. She treated him like a playmate, a story listener, a puzzle helper, and once her tea party guest of honor. The innocence in her laughter melted something in him that he hadn't realized was frozen. One evening after a rare day off for Allison, the three of them found themselves back at the park. The city was quiet in that way only winter evenings could be. The snow hadn't started yet, but the air had that stillness that suggested it was coming. Grayson had brought a small kite, an impulsive buy, one he wasn't sure Sophie would enjoy in the cold. But her face lit up when she saw it, and within minutes she was running across the field, dragging the string behind her, laughing like it was the best thing in the world. Allison stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. He noticed and quietly draped his scarf around her neck without saying a word. "You don't have to do that," she said softly, but didn't remove it. "I want to," he replied. They watched Sophie together in silence, and after a few moments he spoke again. "I used to think I didn't want a family, that it would distract me, slow me down." Allison looked at him, but said nothing. "But now I realize I was just afraid of not knowing how to have one." She turned toward him slowly, caught off guard by his honesty. "I've been alone a long time," he admitted, "and when you get used to loneliness, it starts to feel safe. Predictable. No one to disappoint, no one to lose." Her eyes softened. She knew that feeling better than he could imagine. "But when I collapsed that day, I didn't think about my company. I didn't think about the empire I built. I thought about the fact that if I died, no one would cry for me. Not the way your daughter cried to save a stranger. No one would pray for me to wake up." Allison's throat tightened. She didn't speak for a long moment. "She's been through a lot," she finally said. "We both have. Sophie's father, he passed away when she was still a baby. We never had much, but we had each other. And I promised myself I wouldn't bring anyone into her life unless I was absolutely sure." Grayson nodded, taking that in with the same seriousness he gave to billion-dollar contracts. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "Not now. Not until you're sure. But I want to be around. I want to keep knowing her. And you." She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the billionaire, not the CEO, but the man who'd nearly died and came back wanting something real. Something fragile and beautiful and terrifying. "You already are around," she said finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. Then Sophie's kite nosedived into the snow, and she let out a dramatic squeal. Both adults laughed, and Grayson ran forward to help her pull it free, slipping and nearly falling on the ice, much to Sophie's delight. And as Allison watched them, her daughter's laughter ringing in the air, the man who was once a stranger now tangled in her world, she felt it for the first time. Not fear, not hesitation, but hope. Warm, quiet, and stronger than she expected. The first snow came overnight, blanketing the city in a hushed softness that muffled the usual morning chaos. By sunrise, rooftops shimmered with fresh powder, streets sparkled under the glow of traffic lights, and the world outside Allison's apartment window looked almost magical. Sophie pressed her nose to the glass, eyes wide with delight. "Mama, it snowed. It's like a snow cake outside." Allison smiled sleepily as she poured hot chocolate into two mismatched mugs. She had the day off, miraculously, and had promised Sophie a full day of snowmen, cocoa, and cartoons. But there was something else on her mind. A message. Grayson had texted her the night before. "I have something I want to ask you, tomorrow. Can I come by?" She hadn't responded immediately, not because she didn't want to see him, God she did, but because her heart was already doing that thing again, that dangerous, hopeful fluttering she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. It scared her, but she had answered simply, "Yes, morning is fine." Now it was morning. Sophie danced in her pajamas, singing to her bunny while building towers out of cereal boxes. Allison tried to stay calm, but her stomach was in knots. She dressed slowly, pulling on a soft gray sweater and jeans, curling her hair loosely, applying just a touch of lip balm. Casual, she told herself, comfortable. But every movement was careful, deliberate. At precisely 9 a.m., there was a knock on the door. Sophie rushed to answer it, throwing it open before Allison could stop her. Grayson stood in the hallway, holding a snow globe in one hand and a bakery box in the other. He was dressed in a navy wool coat dusted lightly with snow, his smile as soft as the morning light streaming in from the hallway windows. "Delivery for two very important ladies," he said with a playful bow. Sophie squealed with delight. "You brought cake!" "And snow," he added, handing her the globe. "Shake it and make a wish." She did, shaking it wildly and spinning in a circle, glitter and snowflakes swirling behind the glass. Allison stepped aside to let him in, her heart thudding a little too fast. They sat at the small kitchen table, eating flaky pastries and sipping warm drinks while Sophie played nearby, humming to herself. The mood was cozy, familiar, but beneath it, something unspoken brewed. After Sophie wandered into the living room to color, Grayson turned to Allison. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he began quietly. She looked at him, her eyes cautious. About what? About how life changes when you stop running from it. She didn't answer, letting him continue. You know, before I met you, I thought I had everything. Money, power, privacy, but none of it felt real. It was all control, carefully built walls to keep people out, to keep myself safe. Allison listened, fingers tightening slightly around her mug. And then I collapsed, he said, and I woke up to your daughter's face, to your voice. And for the first time, someone cared, not because of what I could give them, but because I was a person, just a man on a bench, slipping away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Allison's breath hitched. Grayson, it's not what you think, he said quickly, opening the box to reveal not a ring, but a key. She blinked, confused. I'm not proposing. Not yet, he added with a gentle smile. But I am offering something. Something more than visits and walks in the park. I bought a place, not far from here. Smaller, warmer. It's not about grandeur. It's about being close to the only people who've made me feel human in a long time. Allison stared at the key, her heart in her throat. You want to move here? I want to be part of this life, he said simply. Yours, Sophie's. I don't expect anything. No promises. I just want to be near you, to show up, every day, in small ways, the real ones. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. He didn't offer diamonds. He didn't offer a fairy tale. He offered presence, intent, a real beginning. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Just say I can keep trying, he said, reaching out and gently taking her hand. She looked at him, truly looked, and in his eyes saw something she never thought she'd find again, a future. Sophie looked up from her coloring book then and asked, completely unaware of the moment, Can he come sledding with us later? Allison laughed, tears slipping down her cheek as she nodded. Yeah, honey, I think he can. The day of the first true snowfall arrived in full force, transforming the city into a winter wonderland. Streets were softened with layers of white, rooftops looked like frosted cakes, and the park near Allison's apartment had become a playground for bundled-up children with red cheeks and snow-covered mittens. Sophie had been up at the crack of dawn, bouncing in her bed, shouting about snow angels and sled rides. Her excitement was infectious. Allison had barely managed to coax breakfast into her before dressing her in a puffy beige snowsuit and matching hat. As Sophie stood in the hallway, practically vibrating with energy, Allison pulled on her green wool coat, wrapping a scarf around her neck. Then there was a knock. Sophie flung open the door before Allison could get there. Grayson stood in the hallway, dusted with snowflakes, holding two bright red sleds under one arm and a steaming to-go tray of hot chocolate in the other. He wore a knit beanie that was slightly too big for him and a navy parka that made him look far more approachable than the polished suits ever had. Ready for adventure? He asked, eyes twinkling. Sophie cheered and threw her arms around his legs. Allison just shook her head, smiling despite herself. You're spoiling her. She deserves to be spoiled, he replied, handing her a cup. And so do you. They made their way to the hill at the edge of the park, which was already dotted with laughing families. Sophie dragged her sled behind her like a knight heading into battle, and Grayson followed closely, carrying extra gloves and snacks like the devoted snow day sidekick he'd quickly become. Allison watched him, her chest tightening with something warm and unfamiliar. He didn't look like the powerful CEO who made headlines. He looked like a man who had finally found what mattered. They spent the morning sledding and chasing Sophie through the snowdrifts, building lopsided snowmen and throwing gentle snowballs. Grayson laughed more in those few hours than he had in the last decade. He fell into the snow, let Sophie climb on his back, and even lost a race to her on purpose, earning a triumphant, "I beat the grown-up," from Sophie that echoed across the park. By midday, they were all soaked and rosy-cheeked. Back at the apartment, Allison made grilled cheese sandwiches and soup while Grayson helped Sophie out of her wet clothes, setting her up with a cartoon and a blanket. Then the two adults sat quietly at the small kitchen table, warm mugs in hand, watching steam rise and swirl. Allison looked at him, truly seeing the change. You're different now. I feel different, he said. I don't wake up thinking about market projections or merger deals. I wake up wondering if Sophie wants pancakes or cereal. I think about the way your laugh sneaks out when you're caught off guard, about how you make this tiny apartment feel like a castle. He reached into his coat pocket, but this time there was no key, no box, just a folded sheet of paper. I started writing again, he said, sliding it across the table. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. His handwriting surprisingly neat. It was a letter, not a love letter, not exactly, but a thank you, a confession, a promise. He wrote about how he had lived for years without truly living, how he had learned more in the last month from Sophie than in all his years of business, how her quiet courage and Allison's unwavering strength had taught him what family could mean. Not blood, not obligation, but presence, love, and showing up even when it's hard. At the end, he wrote, I don't know what we are yet or what this will become, but if you'll let me, I want to find out, with you, with Sophie, not as a billionaire, not as a man who has everything, but as someone who wants to give everything to the only two people who ever made me want to stay. Allison's eyes burned with tears, and she looked up at him, speechless. You don't have to say anything, he whispered. I just needed you to know. She didn't speak. She simply reached across the table and took his hand. That night, they curled up on the couch together, Sophie asleep between them, her head resting on Grayson's shoulder, her bunny clutched tightly in her arms. Snow continued to fall outside the window, blanketing the city in quiet peace. And in that tiny apartment, filled with warmth and laughter, and the soft rise and fall of Sophie's breathing, Grayson finally understood. This was the life he never knew he needed. And now that he had it, he would never let it go. This story began with a simple moment, a child's voice, a stranger in distress, and a mother doing what she does best, showing up with compassion and courage. But what it became was something much deeper. It's about healing, not just from illness, but from loneliness, grief, and the invisible weight we all carry. Grayson wasn't saved by medicine alone. He was saved by presence, by a child's innocence, and a woman's quiet strength. Allison didn't need saving, but she found safety in someone who finally saw all of her, both the capable doctor and the tired single mom. Together, they didn't fall into a fairy tale. They built something fragile and real, something earned. I believe stories like this remind us that the most extraordinary changes often begin in the most ordinary places. A park bench, a cup of hot cocoa, a snow day. And maybe love doesn't arrive with grand gestures or perfect timing, but with patience, small acts of kindness, and a willingness to stay. Because sometimes the family you never knew you needed is waiting just around the corner, in the form of a little girl holding a bunny,